I'm going to start by introducing our guest. Nick has been an environmental planner with the Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality, helping build water infrastructure across the state, a planner for the city of Dana Point, California, a planner for the city of Encinitas, where he was a part of the team that obtained the city's first certified housing element in over 2 decades, overcoming several land issues, challenges, and regulatory barriers. More recently, he was planning manager for Riverside County. Prior to his work in the private sector, Nick worked as a planning consultant and within the construction industry as a project manager. Nick holds a master's degree in community development from the University of Nebraska and a bachelor's degree in urban planning and sustainability from Arizona State University. Nick became the City of Los Altos Development Services Director in May of 2022 and the city's Assistant City Manager in April of 2024. We're thrilled to have Nick Zornes with us here today. Nick, thanks for spending some time with us this morning. We're going to start off with your presentation, and then I'll have some questions, and we'll go to audience questions. Nick, please take it away.
Great. So we're gonna kind of just go through a few quick slides just to kind of orient because I'm not sure if everybody on the call has kind of followed along as we've made progress on the downtown parking study. I mean, as I'm sure most people on the call are aware, is the city though has done multiple parking studies over the last several decades. So that being said, is a part of this project, we unearthed all of the prior data, the prior recommendations, the work, and reviewed it all as a part of this process. As much as data as was out there, and policies or thoughts about how to do things that were never executed, it did give us a lot of good background data to be able to see, well, one, has the issues changed? Has our supply of parking increased, decreased, kind of leveled off? Where are we at? So kind of a real good temperature check actually was able to kind of be evaluated during kind of that part of the analysis. So we did actually essentially initially start this with authorization in the housing element 2 years ago, believe it or not. So January of 23 is when we authorized and approved our housing element, which contained this program. We released an RFP in summertime of that year, went through the process of selecting a consultant, and at the end of 2023, made a consultant selection, which is W-Trans, which W-Trans is a transportation planning and engineering firm that specializes in various transportation analysis and projects. This specific project manager, Brian, was an individual that literally specializes in parking studies all around the Bay Area and California. That being said, is that we then had to do our data collection to kind of do what's our baseline now today, especially after all of these years of great data that we had previously. And we did that during December of 2023. I want to point out that that's really important to emphasize because I do know that some folks are always concerned with, well, when did you collect the data, so on and so forth. December is the peak season and period for sales tax generation in downtown Los Altos, meaning that it is the highest frequency and traffic that we do see in downtown. That being said, I'm going to say the caveat because I know a lot of folks will say, oh, well, what about the Art and Wine Festival, or what about, when we're doing, specialty like farmer markets and so on and so forth. Those are outliers, and those do not get to be kind of considered as a part of your actual transportation demand. That would be like something as if you were building parking facilities, at an event center, like a convention center or some type of an arena. We're not that type of a downtown that has those types of amenities. So those are kind of the outliers that you just have to plan for those as a part of the event planning and working with, Anthony Carnesecca in the city manager's office when you're doing special events, so on and so forth. But that being said, that data collection period was really great to get it at such a high peak demand season. And then additionally, we did the traditional parking reports do 2 full days, and we did 3 full days. We wanted to make sure that we had enough data that supported 2 days during the week, and then 1 day during the weekend, so that we really had a good spread and was able to have a good representation of what the parking demand is. From there, just at a year ago, that's then when we had to start doing the actual analysis of what that data looked like. So the consultants were very busy for a few months actually looking at that parking data. And then that jumped into essentially springtime last year of starting to do the public outreach, meeting with folks in the community, so on and so forth. And then from there, it went into strategy development, where then in the summer, we then were provided an administrative draft. That administrative draft it contained all of the things that essentially ended up being prepared and shown to the public, which is what was shown towards the end of last year. So that's kind of what has brought us up to this point today. Fundamentally, what is kind of the big outcome is that when we surveyed during those 3 days during the peak holiday season, the overall peak was a 60% average occupancy, and that is between the public and the private parking that is in downtown. We did find that most vehicles did park fewer than 2 hours. So essentially, truly being indicative of essentially the come and go type of traffic that we have for a retail and service-based industry for a lot of our businesses. Come eat, come shop, come get your hair done, whatever personal service, and then they have left. So very indicative of what you see in downtown types like what we have here in Los Altos. The atypical, though, is that what you see is with some of the long-term folks that definitely are staying much, much longer than the 2 hours, and obviously more than just like 3 or 4 hours. So meaning people that are there for 6 to 8 hours, aka the people that are working in downtown. So that's a very common trend, is that those are the folks that we saw. So the spread difference was really kind of that when you kind of looked at the raw data, is that you had the short time folks that were there for their specific business that they were there to do, and then the folks that were there actually conducting business. With that being said, some of the challenges that were identified, this kind of came out of the community engagement and public outreach, is that reserved private parking is one of the challenges, employee parking and the enforcement, allocation of public space, high market values and lack of high quality transit limit potential strategies, future parking demand in downtown core, limited funds to replace for replacement parking. And that's from essentially what's either been collected or what the city has specifically to allocate from that. However, the number 6, that doesn't necessarily mean that there wouldn't be money in the future if something like an in lieu fund was set up for individuals that were looking to kind of have a modification of parking standards. So with that being said, is there are obviously various different challenges that were identified during the process. Again, a lot of these are actually similar to what has been essentially reported and found in the last several decades when we've done, smaller, or piecemealed or, bifurcated analysis with the parking in downtown. So it is also just somewhat of a reinforcement of these are the same problems. And they're not changing based on the fact that we haven't also did significant strategies and improvements to what we're doing downtown when it comes to the parking. So with that, I'm going to kind of just jump in to kind of just a high level overview of what our solutions and strategies were. So they're really broken up into 2 major pots, which is the short term and then the midterm. Short term being the first 2 years after adoption or acceptance of this strategy, and then the 2 to 5 year kind of window thereafter. And so a lot of that ends up being, we need to improve some of our data and some of our informational literature that is either available in downtown or on the city website. Obviously, that will help to be able to be shared with, certain businesses, as well as some of our partners like Lava and the Chamber, that they would be able to push out some of that information when it comes to what's available for downtown parking options. There's been multiple times that wayfinding has been mentioned, in various different studies, people of interest when it comes to improvements to downtown. That is still something that reigns to be true, is wayfinding for, helping folks indicate where parking actually is available, is something that is still kind of coming up. A business improvement district, which has a component of a TMA, which is a Transportation Management Association. So those are kind of together and integrated as a part of that. And that's to really be able to address and assess specific transportation issues and hurdles, linking that with the businesses as well as the other stakeholders that are specifically finding certain challenges. And that's something that was, one of the newer findings that did come out after talking with the various different stakeholders. The establishment of an in lieu fee, that's for, folks that if there's a deviation from the required parking standards for, parking demands, is that would be something that is allowed. Bike parking upgrades, that is something that specifically, I know a lot of people love the decorative bike racks. If you talk to any of our cyclists, they do think and appreciate they're nice. However, they want something that's simple and fairly utilitarian to be able to know where they are and know what they are, and know the means of when they're locking their bikes, that it'll actually help provide them the safety security for their, sometimes very expensive bicycles. That being said, is that online visitor parking permits, that's something that has been kind of the newer emerging technology in the last like 10, 15 years. I'll say from my prior experience working almost exclusively prior to Los Altos in the coastal zone, the online visitor parking permits is something that's been going on for quite some time, because it helps to not have essentially a bunch of infrastructure, like kiosks all around downtown. And it really is just added a little bit of added signage and parking lots so that people can now use the fun invention of QR codes, and so on and so forth. So that's something that the city should look at. And then one of the things that we're going to have to look at is the relocation and also just improvement of the white dot parking stalls, and specifically just kind of reinforcing and have a little bit more of a resurgence with that program in general. Some of the midterm strategies, and this is, obviously everything is meant to be built upon, is so you don't have to necessarily do everything all at once. But it's meant to be is when you start seeing certain components is that you, or issues, is that you start essentially turning up kind of some of how you manage the parking demand. You don't manage a demand until you start having one, because otherwise you're spending sometimes thousands or millions of dollars on parking infrastructure that when you don't have the initial demand for it up front. So like I mentioned before, is that the bid, or the business improvement district with the TMA associated with it, is something that we should begin the process in the short term, which does require outreach. It does require additional study and analysis specific to that, because there's a various different ways to structure it. And then you then would move into when and how do you actually establish it? And so it's two different components, but a shared, essentially, final resulting product. Executing shared parking agreements. That's something that should be as an ad-needed basis. Specifically, we could start doing that today. They are fairly straightforward and very standardized these days. And so that's something that you really start looking at, is if someone has surplus and someone has a deficiency, how can you help essentially link those together? So that's something that, again, we will do in the future, but it is and will always be as an ad-needed basis. You don't execute them up front for no a specific demand and purpose. Update parklet pricing standards. That's something that was identified and mentioned in the public comment and community outreach is to obviously, it's not that we're going to, it's just that we have to be mindful of where the market is at. And obviously, over the years, as things and the market conditions continue to improve, we need to evaluate and price the parklet, uh, prices essentially to be congruent with what the demand and the benefits that they're reaping for both the city as well as patrons as well as the businesses. So that's really just kind of a ongoing evaluation. That's something that the council, when they adopted the parklet program, as well as our annual fee resolution for everything, is that that will be a part of an annual review anyways. So it's really more so just saying, hey, pen to paper, it's a part of our process. We are going to make sure that we continually look at that to evaluate and make sure we make corrections as necessary. Enhanced parking enforcement. This has obviously been something that has been a big conversation, especially around like Los Altos High School right now, which is a very different issue, but it is also parking enforcement. So enhanced parking enforcement, whether or not that's by person or by automation, that's something, there's multiple different kind of prongs and ways and methods to be able to do such. So we're going to have to evaluate that and really see what works, especially as we continue to kind of grow and build out further some of the areas in our downtown. Enhanced parking, the downtown safety around parking, that talks about lighting, emergency call boxes, stuff of that nature. Not necessarily security or police presence. There wasn't anything identified as that. It's more so essentially what is some of the general amenities that parking should essentially provide and accomplish as a part of having a more localized downtown area so that people do feel safe coming and going from their vehicles and businesses. And provide on-street accessible parking. This is something that is inevitably going to be forthcoming anyways, the more that the city has to do repaving, improvements to pavement management in general. Is the federal government started this process a couple years ago. They haven't 100% released some of the intricate details unless that's happened in the last month or two. But there are some cities, Burlingame, Mountain View, I know are a couple of the ones that have done some initial on-street accessible parking, even when it is a parallel space. So there's just some modification and manipulation of existing infrastructure that would happen with that. And that does come with a further kind of assessment of what's going on in our downtown. And then obviously, and this is something that's actually, kind of getting moved around a little bit, is the repaving of parking plazas. Our transportation division in Public Works is currently working on our boundary and topo surveys to then be able to actually start the process of essentially repaving and resurfacing of the parking plazas in our downtown, the ones that are of immediate need. And so those are some of the initial things that we're actually already starting to work on. But again, in order to do the repaving, you have some groundwork ahead of time. So those are some of kind of the irons in the fire already. And future work, one thing I just want to kind of mention, I've been bringing this up for the last, actually probably since I got here, is that we were going to need to do this. But now it's a reality because we're done with our housing element, which is fantastic. And that's something that is required to get reevaluated every 8 years. Right now, I think a good amount of people on the call are aware that the city is updating our general plan safety element. So the legislature said a few years ago is that once you update your housing element, you are statutorily required to update your safety element. And that comes with the fact is that you're adding more housing. Now you need to make sure that you account for the safety and how the operations, especially during evacuations, big natural disasters, so on and so forth. Obviously, things going on in Southern California right now, this is definitely right. The fact that we're going to have, recently updated it to make sure that we have our up-to-date standards with how we do things and operationally as a city. That's really fantastic. It's just a good thing to make sure that we have in place. That's tracking to be done this summer. That being said, is that then there's going to be a general plan has 7 required elements to it. And a general plan is in order for a city to be a city, whether or not you're general law or a charter city, you have to have a general plan. It's a legal requirement in California Constitution in order to govern as a local entity. That being said, our general plan is very dated, and it needs to be updated and not just refreshed, which is what happened the last time it was touched. So that being said, is there's going to be some big heavy lifts with it. A lot of people kick the can down the curb as long as possible with a comprehensive general plan update because it is such a big lift, whether or not it's time, staff, consultants, as well as a financial commitment. But it is obviously necessary for the governance of the city. That being said, I also kind of just threw in this funny pyramid. The general plan is our highest governing document in the city of Los Altos. And then it goes to specific plans, then zoning code, and then our implementing ordinances and resolutions. So it is the thing that should always come first in regards to how we're doing new documents, new programs, so on and so forth. So it will be essential for us to do that. But a part of the 5 lingering updates that will be beginning when we start this project later this year is a comprehensive update to the land use element, the transportation element, which I will at least just say is sometimes called circulation and sometimes called mobility in other cities. It's all the same thing. That's just more of a nomenclature. Open space and conservation, noise, and air. So those are all really big components. Specifically, the reason why I wanted to bring this all up to the folks on this call is that as a part of the parking strategy, there's been a lot of questions about, okay, circulation and mobility, access, all of those kind of big topics or buzzwords, essentially, as it relates to downtown as well as the city in general. The city, as a part of the general plan update, will be doing the big comprehensive deep dive into transportation analysis that is very big and broad in regards to what we have to look at and analyze. So that is something that there will be in the forthcoming years. The things that are essentially off-street, like the parking, or yes, there are on-street parking, but actually the circulation and the way that we move and have people coming to and from downtown, as well as just Los Altos as a whole, will be evaluated as a part of that process. So that is forthcoming, and that's going to be a big thing that will also help to further evaluate and ensure that we have done all of our due diligence and have everything in the right spot as we move forward. So, and with that, that's the end of my presentation for everyone.
Nick, thank you for the very informative presentation. I have a few questions before you open it up for questions from our guests today. First, based on the parking study conducted by Debbie Trans, the downtown is currently overparked, meaning we have more spaces than we currently use even during the busiest times. However, because we are overparked now, does not mean that will continue to be overparked in the future, especially if we add many more housing units. How does the city think strategically about accounting for future growth?
Sure. So the city has there's a couple things. So one, the city has required all parking or all housing developments in downtown Los Altos to provide the legally required or permissible amount of parking. Just over a year ago, the city updated comprehensively our parking standards to match and mirror for residential development what is the maximum requirements for parking under density bonus. So they match, they're one and the same now, so that they're consistent. And then there are obviously opportunities for individuals to request somewhat of a deviation or a reduction, but that doesn't mean a comprehensive elimination. And I will also say in general, developers they know that they need some parking. It's not, we don't live in in an urban jungle, like a San Francisco, where they really can, people can just walk out their doors. So it is a part of the financial kind of package, is unless people are equity partners, they wouldn't be able to just build housing without it. So I think that's really important for everyone to understand, is that there's people that can't get financing unless they have adequate parking for what their lenders say. So there's one thing state law says, the developers, and then the lenders. That's a big complexity that the city obviously can't control because that's the lending side of stuff, but it is a part of it. That being said, is that the city, though, and so I think we're really far away from having a potential significant hindrance or impact. Is that the study also did state, that we could build another 1 million square feet of non-residential square footage and have adequate parking as of today. So now that doesn't obviously account for if we manipulate existing parking plazas for things of different uses, is obviously being discussed in the community today. But there are those considerations. One thing I will last say is that the general plan will also evaluate things like that when it talks about the mobility and the circulation, as well as the land uses specifically for downtown when we go to start doing that analysis. So we'll reinforce a lot of this stuff that we already know, but also get to reevaluate it to see what changes in the next few years.
Thank you. You mentioned the large number of private parking spaces that offer opportunities if the city partners with them. Has the city approached any private parking lot owners, and has there been any positive developments there?
So not at this time, and not as it relates to downtown, because there hasn't been the immediate demand and need for it. However, if it does become of that nature, we will help engage and help process that. However, when we did a parking modification for our 100% affordable project, 330 Distal, which will begin construction in May this year, there was a parking reduction that was granted. As a part of that, though, the county was intentively listening with myself. And so if parking becomes an issue, we've already engaged with MidPen for that specific project to be able to execute a shared parking agreement so that those folks can have off-street parking immediately adjacent to the property. So that's just one direct example of how we can easily start working with property owners immediately adjacent to a property when parking becomes an issue. But again, we have to have a project that influences that demand, and two, we need to know what the demand actually is and not just a perceived demand issue.
Thank you. Palo Alto recently offered one of its city-owned parking lots to be developed for affordable housing, and two developers submitted proposals. Both developers and their proposals are requesting funds from the city to contribute toward the development. Additionally, both developers said that while they would be able to build parking for their tenants, they would be unable to fund replacement parking. Does Los Altos have any funds to put towards affordable projects outside of the waivers and the land? If developers are unable to develop replacement parking in Los Altos, what will be the alternatives?
So the hard and fast answer is that the city does not have direct allocated or set aside dollars for parking replacement or for affordable housing at this time. That could change in the future. Um, Specifically, if developers are unable to replace parking in Los Altos, what alternatives would there be? So if it's a market rate or a mixed income type of a project, specifically if we're talking about residential, and there's the allowance for an in lieu for them to, because they can financially do it, but they just can't physically build it. That's an option that would be available for non-residential square footage. There is also would be that potential in the future for folks to be able to execute an in lieu fee payment, or what our municipal code now allows, which is do a parking license agreement with the city to be able to use additional public parking for offsite private parking demand requirements. So that's something that, again, we would be able to evaluate depending on what the demand and need is of a development or project.
Thank you. Can you elaborate at all with respect to parking enforcement strategies for what might be happening nearer term with respect to downtown parking for both employees and time spots?
Yeah, so obviously we need to improve parking signage, I think and I think that's actually something that is separate from wayfinding signage. I think even as when I take my city employee hat off, and I more so just put my, normal street clothes on like today, and going to be a user of downtown, we don't have as much probably parking signage about telling people what the parking limits and regulations actually are in the actual parking plazas themselves. So we need to probably improve those, and by probably we do. With that is we need to evaluate and make a decision on, okay, well, there's parking plazas, a lot of them, 10 of them, that are open and publicly accessible, but how are we going to prioritize which ones have what restrictions and limitations on them? And that's a more of a user psychology of it, and that's something that the parking study talks about is prioritize the parking plazas that are higher turnover ones to have a shorter allowance of time for the usage and then enforce from there. And so that's something that I know has mixed reviews. However, it actually accomplishes what everyone's concerned with, which is making sure that parking is available to the patrons that are coming to use the establishments and helping keep our businesses vibrant in downtown. So that's going to be, I think, kind of the initial kind of phases that we need to put the parking regulation signs out and then actually enforce them regularly. There's kind of inconsistencies of that signage right now and limited signage as well. So those two things will definitely help in regards to how we keep people moving and ensuring that there is parking available to folks.
Thank you. Any housing developer will likely seek to build at least one stall for every unit and likely two for larger units. But based on commitments to the housing element, residents of housing developments might want to be able to purchase parking passes the same as commercial unit users for other spaces downtown. Do you see, has the city considered doing that?
The city has, yes. So that is a potential that we could allow for, which would also help to fund, if people have overflow and they want to have dedicated parking stalls, they can do so in the future if that becomes something. It's not something that would necessarily be a requirement of a project, though. And the reason why I say that is, anecdotally, we have a city employee that lives in one of our neighboring jurisdictions, and their complex doesn't have adequate parking and doesn't have additional spaces to be able to rent. And we've talked about it before because, just interested in parking, and they've asked, well, how would you guys do it? And if it was potential for them in their city and jurisdiction, they'd be able to do something like that because they want the dedicated space so that they're not having to kind of try to find space on street or off street. So there is those potentials in the future, but we wouldn't make it a requirement again until it's more of an amenity to be able to provide an allowance for folks to be able to take advantage of that.
Thank you. As we move forward with affordable housing on Plazas 7 and 8, can you give us more specifics about potential plans for interim placement parking for the stalls that we lost on those two parking plazas?
So so if any plaza were to get developed, um, there's twofold, especially because we're overparked. So I know this isn't going to be a warmly received thing. when I say it, but the data is the data. And the numbers, I can't say that we don't have available parking stalls. I mean, I think it's great. What Gary said at the beginning of this is like, downtown was super busy last night. That's fantastic. However, we probably in some of our other random plazas probably had some availability if we were making employees park in the further off, less utilized spaces, so on and so forth. Um, so with that being said, is if any of the plazas were to get redeveloped with something, whether or not it's housing, whether or not it's a park or theater, there's obviously a lot of different interested projects and programs for downtown. What it will take us to do is it will take us to make sure that we deploy these short-term solutions up front, like the wayfinding, the parking enforcement, to make sure that stalls that can be available are being made available, and people aren't just leaving vehicles in downtown because they, are coming and going in other vehicles, so on and so forth. And that will be one of the initial things that we need to do in order to address it. As a part of the wayfinding signage, and was also something that was included in the study, was also parking occupancy signage, as well as those online tools and things. So I'll say like the city of Laguna Beach in Southern California, where I used to live nearby, they have where you can go on an app, and because they have their programming done with what they've done with technology, is you can and you're not in parking garages, it will show you what on-street spaces are available, or even what some of might become available within like a 15-minute increment, because a meter might be able to expire, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different options about how we can show people that parking is accessible and where it is. And that's going to be huge. I will say the one thing that's it's kind of implied, but there is a lot of private parking that is obviously not getting utilized. It was built, and we have square footage attached to it, and I'm talking about non-residential square footage. And by making sure that we're enforcing parking time regulations for the public parking plazas, we probably will see some of the occupancy actually become more available for folks, because those people will start using their non-enforced private parking. It's just a matter of convenience. That being said, though, is that we also know that there's the availability for us to execute those shared parking agreements. So again, this strategy is a toolbox for us to be able to pull from and be able to employ solutions to be able to make sure that we have additional adequate parking in the future.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. Uh, Great conversation. I want to now open it up for attendees to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you. Remember, one question per person, no speeches, please. Any questions out there for Nick's answers? No? Oh, Gary and then Sue.
So Nick, I looked at the short and midterm solutions or proposals, and it's a lot of better use of the space, more efficient use, but I don't see that any new spaces are being built. So is there a goal to actually, maybe not, you've already said we're overbooked, overparked, so maybe there's no goal to try to increase the number of spaces right now?
There's no immediate goal or intention on adding additional parking spaces when there's already a known surplus.
Okay. Sue.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the question about replacement parking in the downtown parking lots. I know you know that I'm hoping that we're going to get some affordable housing there. And you talked about the developer paying in lieu fees if they couldn't put the replacement parking on site. But an affordable housing developer is not going to be able to pay the in lieu fees. And as you said, the city doesn't have much money to contribute. So could you explain better how that might work after we've seen what happened in Palo Alto, for example?
So I think that, well, one, not every project is a 100% affordable project that's built. So, I mean, I see more applications for mixed use income or mixed income developments than I do for 100% affordable. And so with that being said, is when there's any types of developments is that there's the opportunity for some people to essentially fee out. And so that's more so a general comment across the board, not necessarily just for Plaza 7 and 8, which was included in our housing element. So there's a variety of different tools that should be in place for when we don't necessarily need them for a very specific project. You are correct, Sue. I mean, it's been well kind of talked about is that, you know, the initial kind of process in Palo Alto with people like Alta Housing that have made offers and stuff did not talk about replacement parking and actually have asked for additional contributions beyond just the parking lot, essentially land donation.
See you later.
However, I think that as we work through our surplus land transactions for Plaza 7 and 8 as it relates to affordable housing, we will see what the offers and what they are intending as a part of their financial stack as well as their partnership with the city as well as with other developers in regards to how they kind of can build their programmatic kind of finances. I mean, I will say my head's kind of going in 10 different directions because of the new administration in regards to what funding sources are and will and are not going to be available in the future. And it's very uncertain. So the city is trying to take as many steps as possible for us to be able to, that's why we applied for our pro-housing designation, which would help be a higher priority in receiving additional state level funding for affordable housing. So there's things that isn't necessarily that it has to become out of essentially one pocket of money, but the things that our housing manager is trying to work on in order to be able to put us in place for essentially having higher priority in the process. So there's not a hard and fast answer, but you know the in lieu thing is more so for any type of housing development that were to get built in downtown Los Altos, because I do think that we should have that as a potential option for development.
Thank you. Jim Fenton.
Hi, thank you. Early in your presentation, you had some data on occupancy, something like 60% parking occupancy in the city, or rather in the downtown. Can you give an idea how that breaks down between publicly and privately owned parking spaces? I assume that assumes both right now.
Yep, give me 1 second to scroll and find it. So, we'll use Wednesday. Wednesday at noon is actually one of our highest occupancy days actually in Los Altos. So parking supply. So there's almost 400 on-street parking spaces. There's just over 1,300 off-street spaces, so in the plazas. And there's just over 800 known private parking spaces in private development, which essentially altogether comes together cumulatively at just over 2,500 spaces. At our highest of all of the study times, there was 74% occupied. So meaning that there was a 26% vacancy of public on-street parking. Off-street parking, the highest during the survey time was 71%. So meaning that off-street in the parking plazas that 29% of parking stalls were available. And then for off-street private, the highest was 38% occupied, meaning that there was a 62% occupancy of vacant spaces in those plazas. So it does break down to kind of having that average of 60% occupied, meaning that we're about 40% overparked in downtown.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Freddie and then Ginny.
Good morning, Nick. Thanks so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask you about handicap parking. The handicap parking is in the plazas, and I personally don't think there's enough of them. And I'm wondering if the city has any plans to increase the number of handicap parking spaces, number one. And number two, are there any plans to actually put them, you call it on street, also, plazas and on street? Thank you.
Yes. So as a part of all of the repaving that needs to happen in the next few years in downtown, that will be a part of the restriping as a part of the process. So we will have to essentially accommodate a couple losses at minimum. If we were to do none of the projects we've discussed today, and we weren't to do anything other than repave all the plazas and repaint the lines, we're going to definitely obviously have to lose a few stalls in order to accommodate the handicap parking spaces in downtown. So that would just be inevitable as a part of the conversation. It's just you have to do it geometrically, essentially. So that being said, is that when we go to also do the street repaving in downtown, we will also have to accommodate that for when we accommodate it. We do know that we need to, as a part of all of these projects, include that. I mean, it's a legal requirement for us to now. So we will have to do that. But that's also, by virtue of having plazas that haven't been repaved or striped in quite some time, is that you have to include that once you do it your next go around. So we will have to account for that.
Thank you. Ginny Lear and then
Yes.
Ann Polson. Ginny.
Nick, thanks very much. On the in lieu parking, the just announced 26 spaces for Luna restaurant. If you didn't say it in the first 5 minutes, I was a little late. Would you say how much that is and what the point is relative to they don't have enough parking and therefore they pay us money and it's okay? And how far out does that go for other businesses?
So what Ginny is referencing is recently the city executed a parking license agreement, which is something that the city has actually had previously, and we've actually had in place specifically actually for Los Altos Grill, which originally was Bandera, all the way back from the 90s. So this has actually been decades that the city has had a license agreement in place with at least one establishment.
Yes.
That is to be able to satisfy for non-residential square footage or parking demand, to be able to utilize the public parking plazas that do not have the benefit of the properties that front State and Main, which are considered in the parking district for downtown. So because Luna's is immediately adjacent to a plaza, but not on State or Main and not in the parking district, the municipal code allows for us to enter into a parking license agreement for them to be able to satisfy the parking demand off-site and pay a nominal fee for that. The current fee is mirrored off of what the parklet rate of parklet rate is, which is $3 a square foot, which is a typical parking stall is 8 by 19. So 8 feet by 19 is 162 square feet times 3 is $486 per stall per year. We're talking about 26 stalls. That means annually the city will collect just under $13,000 from that business in order to be able to meet their parking demand. Again, this is something that Los Altos Grill has been doing for decades in order to meet their parking demand.
Thank you for the explanation.
Thank you. Anne, last question.
So in the short-term efforts, one of them was selling parking permits online. And I didn't quite understand that because I thought we weren't charging for parking. So what are we selling online if they can already park for free?
So the online visitor permits is if we actually were enforcing our like 2 hour maximum parking requirements, so on and so forth, in the public parking plazas, and they didn't want to park, at the farthest one that has no time restriction, is that there's that option essentially to be able to create that you're not going to regulate the entire plaza to essentially, have mechanical arms and a ticket booth type of a deal, like you see in a lot of other jurisdictions. But that if they want to do that, they could be a longer term visitor pass that they could do for whatever purpose. It's also kind of multi-pronged, is that can also be what you kind of blend together with the white dot parking program. Instead of having two separate ones, is that they can do it online and pay for it to essentially accomplish their parking need and be able to park in different places rather than just a white dot program. So it's more so one of the tools that we could use as a part of a solution if that became a problem in the near term.
Thank you.
Nick? We're coming up on closing time here, 9:30. Before you go, I want to make a few announcements. Our next meeting is on Friday, February 21st from 8:30 to 9:30 a.m. Please join us for a discussion entitled An Introduction to New City Council Member Larry Lang. If you'd like to be added to the LACC mailing list, please send an email to info@losaltoscommunitycoalition.org. This email is posted in chat for your convenience. We want to express a big thank you to the Los Altos Mountain View Community Foundation providing LACC with financial and in-kind support. Nick, I want to thank you again very, very much for joining us today and for your years of service to Los Altos, most recently as our Assistant City Manager. Thank you so much for joining us today. And that's all, folks. We'll see you in a couple weeks. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Kim.